Hi, this is Mikey from Aevo Prep Academy, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the enhanced ACT that is to begin this fall, the fall of 2025, and how that might compare to the previous version, as well as how it competes against College Board's SAT and what might be the right choice for you or your child. So let's actually talk about this from the perspective of students studying in Korea, because that's where we are right now. And even though I'm speaking English, I'm hoping that there's subtitles below that's going to translate much of what I'm saying into Korean as well. Now, the main question that we have to ask ourselves is why Korea has been more of an SAT market than the ACT market. And this has been pretty standard for as long as I can remember. But I think there are a few reasons that this is the case. One of the main reasons is really just the nature of the SAT and ACT, even within America. ACT is headquartered in Iowa, if I remember correctly, while College Board is headquartered on the East Coast. Now, if you remember back in the 1970s, 80s, and even in the 90s, when a lot of Koreans were moving to America or immigrating to the United States, we see most of the people going to places like Los Angeles or Seattle, or perhaps New York, New Jersey, or Atlanta, both regions where SAT is much more popular. So when these students either came back to Korea to pursue their international education within the country, or when the parents relay information to relatives within Korea, well, it turns out that they're more familiar with the SAT, so it sort of has that historical precedence of being the more popular test in Korea. Now, ACT in America is much more popular, or has been much more popular, in the Middle West region. So, for instance, places like Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan even, these are the areas that we used to call the ACT states, and schools would implement their ACT exams within the school. Of course, they would do SAT as well, but it would be simultaneously administered because it was such a popular test. In fact, I'm going to put up a little graph over here, but you can see that up until very recently, even in North America, you can see that ACT actually had a little bit of an edge over SAT in terms of the percentages of students who took one or the other test exclusively. Now, of course, many students did opt to take both exams, which is an option for pretty much anyone, but you can see that around 5 to perhaps 8 years ago, the trend started shifting in the States too. Now, of course, in Korea, it's always been SAT, about 9-1. But as I mentioned, that was sort of the historical contingency of the different regional variations in the exams that we saw. Now, the other reason that I think the SAT has been gaining an edge more recently and also fortifying or bolstering SAT's prominence in Korea has a lot to do with what actually happened in terms of the digitization of these exams in the last decade. The thing is, ACT is and has been administered via paper-based exams in the United States. But in Korea or any international markets, the ACT went digital several years back. In fact, ACT went digital before the SAT went digital. And one of the things that happened was that unlike SAT, where the Blue Book program can be run on a student's laptop and the exam can be taken at school, ACT had to be taken at very particular ACT centers in Korea, which made it even less attractive, as the logistics of registering and taking a test in an unfamiliar place would have made it a little bit more difficult of a choice to make. But I think there's something else that happened here. You see, when ACT went digital a couple of years prior to the SAT, one of the things that happened was that they simply took the existing paper-based ACT exams and then they put it on to the computer, which means that certain sections like reading, where you have long passages, well, now the students were having to read these long passages with very little ability to kind of sit down and annotate at a very physical level like you would do with a pencil, underlining things. I mean, of course, there were toolkits available on the program, but it was less familiar than what students were trained to do in school and for the SAT or when they were being trained at academies. Now, the other sections may not have had that big of a change moving from a paper to digital, but I think ultimately it was still at a time when students, I think, were less familiar with doing a lot of things online. Now, I think COVID changed a lot of that, but at the time, it may have coincided a little bit, but I still got feedback from students saying that, look, I mean, I much prefer to take this test on paper because I can write notes, I can draw arrows, all of which couldn't be done with the digital format. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, the SAT went digital too, so what's going on with ACT? Why aren't more people kind of equalizing these two tests? Well, the thing about the SAT that you have to know is that the SAT gets refreshed quite a bit. Even in my years of teaching the SAT, I've already seen 4 variations of the exam, including the one that I took. Which means that every time the SATs refresh, whether it's paper to paper or especially paper to digital, there's actually a change in the entirety of the exam. And the refresh that happened when SAT went digital was actually built like a digital test. What this means is that no longer do we have these long passages that were, let's say, I don't know, maybe 400 to 500 words in length, but they were very short paragraphs. And each paragraph was connected to a single question so that you didn't have to read a long passage and answer multiple questions based on the understanding of that entire passage. And I don't really have to say much of this because most of you who are watching this video are probably already familiar with the current version of the SAT. So with that, it's kind of like comparing cars, right? So you have cars that are electric, that were built from the ground up to be electric vehicles. That's sort of like the SAT. The format of the exam was designed to be a digital test. On the other hand, ACT is like taking a normal internal combustion engine car and simply replacing the engine with motors and batteries. And you can kind of see why that would have some issues that you would not normally see in a car that's completely designed from the ground up to be an electric car. Now, I know that this analogy might not be the best, but it's really the best that I can do. Now, some other differences when it comes to not so much the format, but the actual content of the exam is that I feel like the SAT is or has always been an exam where it's not completely necessary that you're completely fluent in English. You see, with the ACT, a lot of the questions had to be solved in a relatively short period of time, which means that you have to be a pretty fast reader and you have to have pretty good intuition about English in order to solve some of those English questions that involved a lot of idiomatic expressions. So obviously in Korea, where many students are actually studying English as a second language, it made sense to go to the SAT exam where you're given a little bit more time and you can think more logically through each of the questions and perhaps get to the answer, especially with the older versions of the SAT. Just knowing a ton of vocab probably could get you to a certain level, and then learning grammar could push you over that edge to get your English score to a reasonable level while maxing out on the math scores. But that really wasn't the case with ACT. With ACT, remember that the old version had readings section, the reading section, which had 40 questions based on 4 passages, each of which had 10 questions each, to be solved within a very short period of time, where you had basically less than 10 minutes to pretty much solve the questions that were based on the reading. So it really did involve the ability of students to be relatively fast readers. And I think that put a lot of students at unease, I would say, and they figured that they would rather work through things more logically than by intuition. And that's probably why I feel like a lot of my successful ACT students had been ones that have lived mostly in America and then just kind of came back for high school, and their primary language had always been English. But now that the exam is changing, let's actually talk about some of the changes that are occurring in the future. I think the biggest change here is something that we haven't talked about yet, and I probably should have mentioned this before, but the ACT actually has a science section. Now, the science section isn't really about knowledge of certain scientific facts, like things that you learn in school, but more application-based. It's almost like a math test where the primary focus is on data analysis with some scientific and experimental reasoning that sort of sits at the heart of the exam content. Now, the issue with science is that, once again, if you're not really a sciencey person and you're going into humanities like 문과, then obviously a lot of students would say, no, I don't want to take the ACT. It's not the right test for me. But what's actually happening now is that the composite score, which is the sort of like what you see in the 1600, like the total score in the SAT, for the ACT, the composite score of 36 is no longer going to include science. Now, I think there is a bit of an issue here that we have to untangle, because I think one of the main concerns with this change is that now the ACT actually contains less data about the students if you opt not to take the science test. However, my personal opinion is that ACT has always been a test that included more information than the SAT. If you think about the SAT, you have the reading and writing, although now they're together, and math. So it's basically English and math. On the ACT, you had English reading. They were separate, but let's just call that English. And then you had math, and then you had science. So you always had this opportunity to provide more data about your scientific understanding and prowess through the ACT exam. So taking that away from the composite, I don't think it's going to have that same level of impact as we might first initially think. What that means is, from the universities or colleges' perspective, they're going to look at the ACT exam and say, well, now the ACT composite score, excluding the science, is assessing the same amount of content that the SAT has always been assessing. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. However, here is where I think things get interesting. If you are going to be applying to an engineering or a science, natural science, or mathematics degree or major, then you should take the science section because it's still available to you. You get the science score as part of what we call a STEM score. It's the science and math score that is a sub score that you get. And of course, there's the essay, but we won't talk about that today. And you can still probably do pretty well if that is sort of your predisposition and your conviction. But what's interesting to me is that now ACT becomes a very viable option for students who are studying humanities or social sciences. So for instance, let's say that you steered away from the ACT because of that science section as you're going to pursue, say, English major or history, or you're going to do, or even business, right? You didn't want to do the science section. Well, now you don't have to. And I really don't think that at the level of the college admissions, and I'm sure ACT is working very hard to work with universities on this front, but they're going to try to equalize the composite score in the ACT, so the new one without that science section, alongside SAT, and say, look, these are going to be relatively similar measures. And of course, ACT is going to say it's a better measure. College Board is going to say that their test is a better measure, but they're going to be competing now at that same level in the absence of the science section. So I think this actually turns out to be a pretty decent option for students who are studying humanities. Another reason that this may be the case is that I've always found that ACT, while the math section contains a little bit more math, as in like it might go up to some pre-calc concepts, I do find that it's less twisted in a sense than the SAT math exam. Now, this could change over time, and this is never going to be something that's completely set in stone. But because of this slight difference in math, I do find that students who are basically better at math at school, but perhaps not really good at solving those sort of AMC style problems, might actually have a better shot at attaining a higher score on the ACT math section. So that actually means that the ACT becomes a very, very decent option for humanities students too, especially if you're very fluent in English and you're, speaking conversational English is really good. Then the English section and the reading section, I feel like is going to be much easier for you than the SAT. Now, and that's because with this very last thing that I want to mention is that you're going to have more time per question on the ACT at this point, right? I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I will put it up on this video. You can see here that you have basically more time for English, fewer questions, probably less time, but when you calculate the amount of seconds or amount of minute per question, it is going to be more. You're going to have more time to think about all of the English sections too. So no longer are you really restricted being a super fast reader to do the ACT exam. Now, granted, we still have the disadvantage of not being able to take ACT at your school. And yes, you still have to answer multiple questions based on a single longer passage in the ACT reading section. But I do find that if you're a pretty good reader, then I feel like the ACT might actually be a little bit easier given that you have more time. So I'm sure that there are so many more things to talk about, but that's sort of where I wanted to begin because I really like this idea of having options for students and having the ACT now being an option for non-science students, and knowing that, the colleges will probably be okay without you reporting a STEM score. I think that gives me a little bit more confidence in perhaps advising certain students with certain skills. And, of course, skills can be different in other people, but skills that is a little bit more catered toward ACT, I might advise them to take a level test on that. It might not be a bad idea. And of course, students are a lot better at doing things on the screen too. So maybe it might be time, maybe not. But if you're watching this video and you're a student, I highly advise that you maybe take a level test for both tests and see how it goes. If you're a parent and you're more curious about, but if you're a parent and you have more questions, well, feel free to give us a call or send us a message, and we'll try our best to guide you in the right direction. Thanks.